This is GM Word of the Week, and I'm Fiddleback. Lost Episode 8. We here at the Word of the Week, like all game masters of tabletop role-playing games, like all creative people really, are nothing but glorified scrap collectors. Your brain is a bit like a vacuum cleaner, swallowing up bits and pieces from everything you experience. And when you later need some clever idea, your brain spits some of those bits out. You know, like an overloaded, clogged vacuum cleaner run over a too dirty carpet. We're not saying that our show is basically just a hairball or dust bunny vomited up by a poorly maintained vacuum. We're saying that every creative work, from Shakespeare to the latest piece of comedy trash starring Will Ferrell, they're all just vacuum cleaner garbage. As a result, almost everything creative is at least partially derivative. Or to put it more bluntly, almost all creativity is theft. And the perpetrators of said crimes, even the comedians who blatantly steal jokes from other comedians, are often unaware of the crime they've committed. It's due to a mental phenomenon called source amnesia. This is a memory disorder, one which almost everyone is prone to episodically, in which you can recall a thing, but you can't recall where you learned that thing. It has been studied since 1948, and it is a well-documented phenomenon. The problem is that the reasons why it happens aren't really well understood, because the process by which the brain stores memories isn't well understood. But two different neuroscientists, Daniel Schachter and Endel Tulving, have each proposed that the cause of source amnesia is that your brain encodes the memories of facts and information differently from the way it encodes contextual information about those facts. And it favors the storage of information over the storage of context. And because your brain already has a hard time distinguishing information it has created from information it is remembering, when the contextual information for a memory is unavailable, your brain will just assume it created the thing itself. Thus, you can firmly believe you invented a joke or story that you heard years ago. Which is not to say that comedians don't steal jokes. There's a long history of joke theft. In the vaudeville days, borrowing material was especially common, and performers even had rules of etiquette about it. For example, famed comedian Milton Berle explained that, among other things, a borrower should add to a borrowed joke and make it his own. Apparently, though, comedian Bob Hope didn't agree, and his accusations that Berle had stolen Hope's material started a vicious feud between the two. For his part, Berle not only didn't deny it, but started calling himself the bad gag thief to make light of the whole feud. But we digress. The point is, we're scrap collectors. We collect little bits and pieces and string them together into stories. But like all creative people, we end up with far more scraps than stories. The problem is, sometimes those scraps are really interesting, and we don't want to throw them away. So we gather them in a big pile. And every so often, when the pile gets too big, we pick out some of the most interesting scraps and share them in what we call a lost episode. Now, we know it has only been about 3 months since our last lost episode, and we're sorry. We do try not to make these things a habit. But there were some particularly big, particularly interesting scraps that we really wanted to work into our recent episodes, and we want to share them before the context of the episodes fades from your memory, leaving only the little informative bits and pieces behind. We begin with a little fact that we have been holding for years in our own memories, one that we have been waiting for an opportunity to share. And when we ended up talking about grognards, and the subject of the Napoleonic War came up, we thought we'd finally have our chance. But two things got in the way. First, that episode already had enough of a word count without a digression about a long out-of-use idiom for which we have an inexplicable fondness. And second, it turned out we were wrong about the origin of the phrase. It didn't come from the Napoleonic War. When we researched it, we discovered we had the meaning slightly wrong. The phrase is, hoisted by your own petard. That's such a fun phrase, isn't it? It means, as you may or may not know, to fall victim to a trap or device you meant to injure someone else with. Basically, it's the punchline of every Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner short ever. You had a cunning plan, it backfired, and you ended up blown up or cowering under a tiny umbrella as an anvil descended on your cranium. Oops. Well, it didn't come from friendly fire incidents involving Napoleonic War-era field artillery as we thought. It's actually older than that. And it came from the days when gunpowder was just starting to catch on, and castles and city walls and other fortifications hadn't gone out of fashion. As explained in a 1598 dictionary compiled by John Florio, a petard was a squib of gunpowder used to burst gates or doors. Basically, an explosive charge used to blow open a fortified gate. Now that may give the impression of a modern satchel charge or a stick of dynamite, but it was actually a bit more complicated. The thing was a metal bell-shaped device, a bit like a tiny fat cannon, and it was hung from two metal legs. What you did was have some poor hapless engineer, which was someone who built and operated engines of war, run up to the enemy gate, hopefully without getting killed by soldiers on the ramparts. He'd carry this petard thing, stand it on the legs, and brace the open end of the bell against the gate. Then he'd light the little hole or fuse at the other end. And then he'd run away. Fast. And then boom. But if he didn't run away fast enough, or the gunpowder exploded early, because these things weren't exactly reliable, there'd be a huge explosion, and he'd be thrown in the air, or hoisted into the air, by his own petard. Get it? The actual phrase was first used by the progenitor of pretty much every idiom before Ben Franklin came along. Old Willie Shakespeare. In Hamlet, the titular character pretends to fall victim to a scheme by his evil uncle Scar to have him executed in England. Claudius. Evil Uncle Claudius. He pretends to go along with the scheme and intends to use the scheme to expose Claudius's treachery to the King of England. And Hamlet decrees 'tis sport to have the engineer hoist with his own petard. You should also note that petard is suspiciously close to the French word péter, which means to fart? Which is no accident. Nor is the fact that it is so close to the word partridge. See, when a startled partridge, a common European game bird, takes flight, its wings make this low noise that sounds like, like that. And so European hunters nicknamed them perdix, which means farting. We hope you'll remember that information the next time you sing the 12 Days of Christmas. But hopefully, you'll forget you learned it from us. Source amnesia, do your thing. Speaking of Napoleon, topic change. Sometimes when we do one of these episodes, we run into a problem because we delight in debunking commonly believed facts and anachronisms. See, many of the things we debunk are things that many other people before us have delighted in debunking. And we don't want to be accused of being derivative or outright stealing. But we're also afraid to leave out debunking something for fear of an endless stream of emails accusing us of missing something obvious and important. This problem is serious enough, to us, to have led to a debate between we, the writer, and we, the producer, about the episode Lemming. Because everyone had so thoroughly debunked the myths of lemming suicide and revealed how that myth had been perpetuated by a Disney nature documentary, we weren't sure we wanted to discuss it at all. So we decided that if we were going to do it, we had to find something no one else knew. Like the fact that Disney hadn't invented the myth, and that it had originated centuries earlier when natural philosophers tried to explain oddities in lemming population numbers. That said, did you know that Napoleon was famously short compared to other French persons of his day? And it was theorized that his entire conquest of Europe was motivated by his... No, wait, don't turn this off. We didn't give that whole speech in the preceding paragraph for nothing. We know he wasn't really short, and we know you know that. But do you know how that myth got started. Did you know it involved a translation error and a lack of international measurement standards and a bunch of fake news? Napoleon's height was recorded as 5 feet and 2 inches when he died, officially. And because the average height of male French persons at the time was 5 feet and 5 inches, this made him pretty short for a French person. And this was confirmed by people who saw him. He was always the shortest person in his little group. He was even nicknamed Le Petit Caporal, the little leader, while he was still alive. Now, Napoleon had just gotten done trying to conquer Europe and destroy all monarchies ever. So Europe, especially the English and the Prussians, were pretty unhappy with the guy. And when news reached the British press that Napoleon was short, they ran with stories depicting him as a tiny tyrant and an angry midget. That's how he got his reputation, and how the Napoleon complex and a bunch of overcompensation jokes got started. Years later, though, like recently, historians discovered something very interesting. They discovered that Napoleon's height at his death was reported in a unit called pouce. Basically, that was a French inch. But it was a unit that had originated before the French Revolution. See, one of the big progressive changes that Napoleon and the French Republic government had ushered in was standard units of measure. They did it to make sure merchants couldn't overcharge people for underweight and undersized goods and stuff like that. This pouce, though, was slightly longer than a British inch. They were still using the English system in England. See? Had the English noticed the slight difference in pre-revolution French inches and English inches, they would have realized that Napoleon was actually 5 feet and 6 inches. Slightly taller than the average French male person. But not by much. What about reports that Napoleon was visibly short? And what about his nickname as the Little Leader? Well, it turns out Napoleon was almost always seen in the company of his personal imperial bodyguards, which he hand-selected. And he tended to choose the biggest, burliest guys he could find, for obvious reasons. And because he was a nice, average-looking guy who was always surrounded by the Revolution-era equivalent of a bunch of linebackers, he looked a little small by comparison. And clearly, because he allowed that image to take hold and didn't select a bunch of skinny, gangly geeks for his entourage, he was pretty secure about his height after all. But enough about Napoleon. When we talked about the man in the moon, we really wanted to include the Norse take on the whole moon thing, especially because it's connected to a modern nursery rhyme in a sickeningly cute way, which juxtaposes it nicely with the vicious wolves chasing it that are going to end the world someday. We even teased that story a bit in the prequel episode Faces in the Clouds. We never paid it off. We're sorry about that. And that's the primary reason we wanted to get this lost episode out into the wild. The story begins with the creation of the cosmos, which technically is where every story begins if you go back far enough. But usually that's just assumed backstory. Now, in the Norse view of things, a lot of stuff involving the creation of the world just sort of happened. There was a fire realm, Muspelheim, and an ice realm, Niflheim, and between them, a gigantic gap, the Ginnungagap. And the ice and fire mixed in the gap, and the giant happened, and he sweated, and more giants happened, and then a cow emerged from the ice, and then some gods came out, and some dwarves were there. It was a strange time, and everybody was a little bit confused. But the gods figured they had to start making sense of everything. Among the various entities that just sort of happened were two beautiful figures, Sol and Mani. Some stories have them just sort of emerging. Others claim they were the offspring of a giant with an unpronounceable Norse name that the producer has refused to attempt. Like everyone else, Sol and her brother Mani were confused and had no idea of their place in the universe. The gods knew they had an important role, though, because they were so beautiful. That's how it works. If you're good looking enough, the company will find a job for you. Odin and company got together and decided that they needed to order the day and the night and bring light and darkness in equal measure to the world. Standard creation myth mumbo jumbo. And they got some chariots and some horses, and give the reins to Sol and Mani and have them drive their chariots across the sky. And thus Sol and Mani become the sun and the moon. And everyone lives happily ever after. Well, not really, because there were some complications right from the get-go. First of all, there's another version of the story that doesn't have such a happy ending. Remember how we said that Sol and Mani might have been some giant's kids? Well, in that version of the story, the sun was already a thing. It was a spark that had come from Muspelheim, and the gods had stuck it in a driverless chariot and set the horses pulling it across the sky. When the giant gave birth to his beautiful daughter, he named her Sol, which means sun, because she was as beautiful as the sun. And you know what happens in pagan polytheistic religions when you proclaim that you've got anything that's as good or better than something the gods did. That's right, the gods were angry at the giant for being so prideful. And basically, they descended on the giant and said, "Oh, ho, 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 you think your little girl is so beautiful she's worthy of the same name as the sun, which we created in our awesomeness to light the whole world? Fine. You want to be the sun's daddy? You got it." And they took Sol away and made her drive the chariot forever. We're not sure why Mani ended up driving the moon in this version, but you know how mythological gods are. They're always punishing persons C and D for crimes committed by person A against god B. It's their thing. Second of all, Sol's chariot of burning fire, which was pulled by two horses named Arvikir and Osvior, kept boiling the seas and scorching the land of Midgard, the earth, where we live, which was a bit of a problem. So at least according to one translation of the epic poetic Edda, a shield-bearer named Svalin rides alongside Sol, and he holds his shield under the chariot to deflect some of the heat and flame. Third of all, the destruction of the universe is inevitable, and everything in Norse mythology knew it. See, there was this coming event called Ragnarok. It's a sort of Norse pun, a play on words, and it means the twilight of the gods. Specifically, it referred to a time when the world would fall apart and turn back into the chaos from which it had sprung. And, unlike Jedi, everything in Norse mythology could see the future really accurately. So, they knew pretty much everything that was going to happen at the end of time. And the gods were always trying to do things to prevent or forestall Ragnarok, and those things always turned out to be the very things that were going to cause Ragnarok. Like how Loki fathered a god-killing superwolf semi-knowingly, and then the gods tried to domesticate the thing and then leash the thing with a rope made of metaphors including, but not limited to, the breath of a fish, the sound of cat footfalls, and the beard of a woman. Yeah, Norse mythology is weird. Anyway, this wolf, Fenrir, was going to kick off Ragnarok by breaking free of his bonds and devouring Odin. But Fenrir also had a couple of kids, Skull and Hati. And those wolves he sent into the sky to devour the sun and moon, to usher in the darkness and chaos of Ragnarok. Skull and Hati leapt up into the sky and began chasing Sol and Mati. And every so often, one of the wolves would catch one of the charioteers and try to swallow them. And that would cause an eclipse. The first time that happened, the people of the world raised such a panicked cry that the wolf got frightened and dropped Mati, and the moon got away. But let's end this on a lighter note. let's talk about the old Norse story that gave rise to a modern nursery rhyme. See if you recognize this one. Juki and Bill went up a hill to fetch a pail of water. The moon came down and stole their pail, and Juki and Bill chased it back up into the sky, and now they live on the moon forever. Yeah, see, the Norse version of the man in the moon is actually two figures carrying a pail, two kids. The boy is Bill, the girl is Juki, and there's a couple different stories about how they ended up there. The first version involves the two kids innocently getting water from a well. As a thirsty Mahdi flew overhead, he spied the kids with the pail and decided to just swoop down on his moon chariot and steal it. The kids chased him, and presumably frightened by the apocalypse wolf that was also chasing him, they jumped onto the chariot. Now they're there forever, because Mahdi sure as heck can't stop and let them off. Because wolf, remember? The second version involves Juki tormenting Mahdi. We're not really sure how that worked. It's sort of fragmented and weird, and there's only bits and pieces of the story. Basically, while Juki and Bill were filling their pail with water from the well, Juki saw the reflection of the moon, and she started making fun of it. Mahdi was annoyed, so he swooped down and kidnapped the kids. He brought them up into the sky and made them clean the moon. So, maybe Juki was making fun of how dirty the moon was? It still seems like a minor offense to be punished by being eternally imprisoned in the sky and forced to wash a celestial object while an apocalypse is also trying to kill it. But again, Norse mythology is weird. Gradually, over many, many years, that story morphed into a rhyme about a boy and girl climbing a hill to fetch a pail of water, and then one of them slips and falls and breaks his skull. You know, it's for kids. It seems like people remembered the basic story about the kids in the well, but forgot where the story had come from or what it was really about. But that's the human brain for you. It just collects scraps and doesn't worry much about remembering where it found them or why. This has been GM Word of the Week. It's written and researched by The Angry GM and produced by me, Fiddleback. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/GMWordOfTheWeek. You can find more at gmwordoftheweek.com and theangrygm.com.